This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I will just say I've got about half of my thoughts organized and the rest will just be my random musing, so I apologize. I had the very great pleasure of attending the first breakout session, and we discussed the poetry of Biddy Jenkinson. I'd like to start by suggesting that there's 4 of the research questions that are of particular relevance to this discussion. Number 3, what kinds of mystical or religious writings are being produced by women in Europe in relation to motherhood? 4, how are motherhood and religion connected in specific national contexts? 7, how do mothers' religious or spiritual beliefs impact on their mothering and on their sense of self as mothers? 13, what kinds of relationships are there between literature and real-life experience, and between literature and contemporary social issues regarding this topic? With these questions in mind, I'd like to share with you some of the key themes that were presented and explored in our breakout session. Maura began by giving us some background information about Northern Ireland and about the use of Gaelic in particular, and I think repeating some of that is useful here. Until about the mid-19th century, Gaelic was the main language of Ireland. Then, following cultural and linguistic shifts, English took prominence. Nonetheless, Gaelic remains a protected language. It is the first language of the state and has been designated a working language within the EU. Despite a resurgent interest in Gaelic amongst the middle classes, the historical reality is that Gaelic was a language of the poorer classes, and it was hardly used for literary purposes. The project of bringing Gaelic back into mainstream culture was therefore motivated by desires to modernize or Europeanize the language on the one hand, but also to respect its historical context on the other. Using Gaelic for literary purposes is not a question about breaking away from the past, but rather a project centered on recuperation. And it is within this framework that Biddy Jenkinson's poetry is situated. It's also worth mentioning some of the interpretations of Limbo which are being used within this poetry. Limbo was understood as one of 4 states of the afterlife. There was heaven, which was pure bliss, hell, eternal pain and suffering, purgatory, where a soul might go to be purged of its sins, but which was not necessarily perceived as eternal. And then limbo. It was an other world which unbaptized souls were destined to arrive. It was not perceived of as punishment, because of course an infant has no control or ability to affect its own fate. For the infant soul who entered limbo, there was neither feelings of pain nor of ecstasy. For the parents, however, limbo was conceived of as a particularly torturous state owing to the eternal separation that one endured from their child. Unlike purgatory, a soul was never released from limbo, and so the parents of deceased children did not even have the comfort of a reunion in the afterlife to look forward to. As Maura pointed out, the concept of limbo was markedly influential in Gaelic literature and as it relates to women as mothers. Examining limbo helps to raise fascinating questions about religious experiences, the functioning of certain concepts within literature, and women's voices. The 2 poems we examined, which should be in your pack, Limbo and Limbo 2, are not unrelated, but as we discovered, they convey 2 very different possibilities for understanding women's religious experiences. I would like to suggest that, roughly, the first poem explores the ways in which women's religious experiences were limited as a result of the doctrines of limbo. And the second poem conversely communicates limbo as a potentially liberating site for women's voices. In the first poem, we are confronted many times over with the liminality of the 4th state of the afterworld. There are several words which I'm just not even going to bother trying to pronounce, but if, for instance, the 5th stanza, so about in the middle of the first poem, there's a word. Would you mind pronouncing it for me?
Sure, yeah.
This one.
Cuine. Cleaner.
So this,
Same word as cleaning.
right.
Lamenting.
This is particularly pertinent because of the strong association with the type of poetry that was produced on the death of someone. But we see this word and we have to recognize how the woman is being denied the opportunity to produce this type of lamentation. She can't simply produce death poetry because her child is stuck in a limbo state. We get lots of reminders about how desperate this situation is. And the conclusions we reached were ultimately that this is a poem of desperation and denial on the part of the woman. She can't cry for her child, she can't allow for her child to cry, and yet we are repeatedly faced with the reality that someone is crying. And of course, what's really effective about this the figure of the cat, is that it blends all of the heartache that is embedded in the state of limbo. Is it the child? Is it the mother? Is it women's experiences of limbo? We can hear all of that through the crying of the cat. In this way, I think it's important to look at how women are incapable of escaping the situation just as the infant soul is incapable of escaping limbo. The women can't put away their sorrow, they can't mourn their child, and they can't feel hopeful about ever meeting their child again. It's a persistent state, and therefore, again, a desperate one. We also looked at the ways in which women are intimately connected with nature in this type of Irish poetry. This is interesting because there were meta-narratives about nation building based on the grandness of nature. Nature always being feminine, ownable, fruitful, but again, grand narratives. And we see some of the blurring between women and nature in that first poem. And I think this sort of freezes women insofar as that they are understood in a very specific way. In the second poem, I think we have a slightly more hopeful look on limbo. And in fact, I think within our breakout session, we enjoyed the second discussion a bit more, and purely in terms of everyone's pleasure. I think everyone kind of left feeling a bit jazzed, to be honest, which is quite something given the first discussion. What I really liked about the second one is that we see the possibilities that limbo has for women's voices within these scenarios. Within the second poem, we have a strong focus on imagined spaces, and I think this has huge potential. Maura asked us to think about what kind of imagined space is being created here by the narrator. What does this imagined space involve? Again, it's very nature-oriented, but you'll notice a very different type of discussion. This is not a meta-narrative of the grandness of nature. It's a micro-narrative of the intimacy of nature and the woman's experiences in it. I think also the dichotomy between national spaces as located in grand narratives of nature versus these micro spaces where this female narrator is capable of creating an imagined space helps us to look at women's religious experiences in this particular context, because it sort of illuminates the ways in which people are psychosomatic unities within Christian thought. Her body is very present. The imaginings she has are very tangible. You can hear snails grazing. You can hear the fluttering of moth wings. the bright sky. You can feel it in your eyes. And yet again, we're reminded that this is about her imaginary and intellectual engagement with the experience that she's going through in the birth and then ultimate limbo of her child. I think ultimately, it's not necessary to break these poems in the way that I have. It doesn't have to be read in this binary way. But it's important, and I think it ties into the discussion we had this morning about whether or not by discussing motherhood, we are simply re-trapping ourselves. By limiting our discussion to women's experiences in terms of motherhood, are we perpetuating a problem which has put us in the position to have these workshops in the first place? And I really liked the way that these two poems confront that question. I think the second poem in particular points to the ways in which certain maternal experiences can open up our field of inquiry and may rely on some of the same tropes that we constantly talk about. Bodyliness, we talk about nature, we talk about maternal feeling, and marginalization within religious contexts. But I think something truly different is going on in this second poem, and I think our discussion was really helpful in illuminating the slippery liminal space that we can have this discussion in more productive and new ways.